Hello and welcome to Computer-Mediated Consent to Sex, the Context of Tinder. My name is Nick Furlo and I will be presenting on behalf of my co-authors today. Sex has gained popularity in the field of HCI in recent years. One aspect that deserves some more research is sexual violence, or activity of a sexual nature without consent from both parties. Despite this, we don't really understand how consent is computer mediated currently, so the next step is to learn more about the roles computers have in the consent process. Previous research has shown a correlation between dating app use and sexual violence. This correlation becomes even more concerning when we see that nearly 50% of adults under 30 have used dating apps, making them one of the most popular ways to meet new sexual partners. So let's discuss how dating applications currently inform consent decisions. We must first understand how online daters currently give and perceive receiving consent. We must also understand how dating app design informs these consent practices. We must learn what challenges users currently face when trying to give and receive consent. And lastly, we have to learn and understand how current design is failing to protect users from sexual violence. We conducted semi-structured interviews with members of the LGBTQIA+ community as well as members of the Greek life community, meaning those in fraternities and sororities. These demographics were chosen due to them being at higher risk of sexual violence according to previous research. And our participants discussed detailed accounts of sexual experiences that began on dating apps, including how consent was given and perceived to be received. Situations where participants described inferring or implying consent was coded as consent signaling. Those participants believed that Tinder is only for casual sex, meaning if somebody is on the app, they must be looking for sex. If they got a match, they assumed that that person wanted to have sex with them, and this also extends to agreeing to meet face-to-face. All of these consent signaling codes were from the Greek life demographic. And this timeline shows a bit of that process for somebody using consent signaling. So it starts with assuming everyone on the app is there for sex, and that matches mean that they want to have sex with you, and that when someone confirms they want to meet face-to-face, that they are confirming they want to have sex with you. Other participants, mainly cisgendered women, explained that this can make them fearful for their safety, as Chloe describes here in this quote. This method is very risky for this reason. None of the situations coded with consent signaling confirmed consent verbally, and the initiators of this consent signaling did not seem educated on consent, or they did not think consent was important. Some participants even explained that they thought bringing up consent and sex with a match was disrespectful. Billy and James both thought that women would not want to discuss consent or sex, as you can see in these quotes. These men believed that they knew when their partners were ready for sex. This was determined through a lack of resistance for the most part. So Jose described disrobing a woman and taking her lack of resistance as consent to sex. On the other end of the spectrum, many participants from the LGBTQIA+ demographic discussed what we coded as affirmative consent. These participants confirmed details about sex and consent verbally before and during face-to-face meetings. These participants attempted to use Tinder's interfaces to foster patterns of consent, and specific sexual acts and boundaries were discussed before ever meeting face-to-face. They explained that this was done in response to violence and other harms that they have previously experienced. Some of these participants discussed putting expectations and intentions explicitly in their bios on their profiles. Willie and Dan both explain here that they put information about consent in their bios, and that this also sparked conversation about consent with their matches. Participants expressed that other members of the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as members of the kink community, were most likely to include information about consent in their profile bios. They explained that they would use messaging to gauge their matches' feelings about and possible resistance to affirmative consent. Kyle explains here that if someone doesn't seem to want to discuss consent, that is a big red flag for them. One strategy that multiple participants employed was to give their matches their Snapchats, and this was basically to give their match the opportunity to stray away from affirmative consent, break their trust, and send nude photos without asking, allowing them to not experience such things in person. So this timeline shows the process of a user who's using affirmative consent. So it starts in the profile discovery, where you are overtly explaining or talking about sex or your interest in sex and the importance of consent. And you also evaluate other profiles for similar overt disclosure. So you're looking for these things you're putting in your profile. And then in the messaging stage, they agree to very specific acts and are very verbose about their boundaries beforehand in this messaging stage. And they allows them to assess the partner's consent practices. And then once they meet face to face, everything is verbally confirmed before any kind of sexual contact occurs. There are some risks that can come with this method still. Using the dating app to mediate consent stops once you are in person. A few participants reported that having such conversations ahead of time can blur the lines a bit once they're face-to-face, as reaffirmation is not always explicit enough. This can lead to ambiguity when giving and receiving consent, as Kate describes here. Across the broader user base, this type of overt and explicit affirmative consent was not found to be common by our participants, which can also cause issues. Several participants discussed times when they attempted to discuss sex and consent, but those attempts were actually misunderstood as sexual advances, as Kate talks about here. So now we're going to talk about the discussion a little bit here. So given that the previous works have shown that dating apps contribute to sexual violence, we propose two possible explanations for this. One is that using Tinder leads users to assume that consent has already been given just by virtue of being on the app and using the application. Two, using Tinder can obfuscate one's sense of sexual agency. Users who use consent signaling assume Tinder is a tool used to expedite the consent exchange, and the ways that Tinder is mediating consent are currently not designed intentionally. We suggest that dating apps attempt to deliberately design to scaffold the consent process to limit these assumptions. In order to do this, designers must decide what types of consent practice to mediate. The literature, the law, and sexual health organizations advocate for affirmative consent, making it a great candidate for such adoption, though limitations, as discussed previously, should be noted. In order to normalize consent, dating apps could be designed to make discussing sex and consent easier and more natural. It is crucial that users be able to revoke computer-mediated consent. This has been documented in critiques of consent apps such as Legal Fling and Good to Go. Thank you so much for watching, and we appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the full text of the paper.